Hello, I'm Chris Annadale, the podcast editor for the Ciceronian Society, and you are about to listen to an excerpt from episode 54 of our podcast, The Sower. This episode was a recording of a book roundtable at the June 2025 meeting of the Academy of Philosophy and Letters. The speaker is Michael Harding of Montgomery College, and his paper is titled Against the Tarantulas, Nietzsche on Aristocracy. Enjoy.
Okay, I'm going to talk about Nietzsche. This is going to be a fairly compressed version of the argument I present in the chapter, and I will say that this presentation presupposes maybe a certain degree of familiarity with Nietzsche's texts. So, in the first essay of the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche writes that, quote, the diminution and leveling of European man constitutes our greatest danger. In Beyond Good and Evil, he writes that the psychological forces manifest in the democratic movement aim at, quote, an abased, more specifically, a diminished form of humanity, a mediocritization and depreciation of humanity. And again, in the Genealogy, Nietzsche writes that we no longer have anything left to fear in man. The maggot is swarming in the foreground. The tame man, the hopelessly mediocre and insipid man, has already learned to feel himself as the goal and zenith, as the meaning of history, as higher man. Nietzsche claims that, quote, the total degeneration of humanity, down to what today's socialist fools and nitwits see as their man of the future, is very possible. And precisely because it is possible, Nietzsche attacks the metaphysical, religious, moral, and political principles that he identifies as having led to this condition. So for Nietzsche, the danger with which he is concerned is not the result of merely cultural or psychological forces. Rather, he roots the human predicament in biology and physiology, albeit not in any crude sense, denying that there is a permanent and fixed human nature. Zarathustra reminds us that the human species is a process. You have made your way from worm to man, and much in you is still worm. Once you were apes, and even now a man is still more ape than any ape. Nietzsche's hoped-for future humanity will view our contemporaries and ourselves as, quote, a laughingstock or a painful embarrassment. Throughout Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche emphasizes the embodied physicality of the human being. When populations mix, different drives and affects, including some which are opposed to each other, also mix. Due to this multiplicity of lineages, there arises a multiplicity of drives competing and conflicting with each other. For most people, Nietzsche suggests, the strongest desire is simply for an end to this interior war. Happiness to the many appears to be rest. Now, how does all this manifest politically? In Zarathustra, we see Zarathustra press the theme that had emerged in Beyond Good and Evil's discussion of herd morality. There, he lambasts the hypocrisy of the rulers. These embodiments of herd morality cannot even bring themselves to admit that they rule. Rather, they want, quote, that no one harm them. There's an explicit link between Zarathustra's discussion and the discussion in Beyond Good and Evil. Zarathustra notes that they cannot even punish the criminal because, quote, they lack fists. Their fingers do not know how to form into fists. They want to, quote, beat everyone to it by doing them a good deed, which is to say they seek to avoid being harmed by fostering a sense of indebtedness in those who might harm them. They've been tamed by their so-called virtues, says Zarathustra, and call it moderation. But Zarathustra, more honest than they, calls it mediocrity. They bite at him not because he finds their small virtues appropriate to small people, a position perfectly consonant with Nietzsche's own moral pluralism, but because Zarathustra finds it, quote, hard to grasp that small people are necessary. This, by the by, is what Zarathustra must overcome. Elsewhere, Zarathustra describes the tarantulas as motivated by revenge. The justice of the tarantula, he says, is revenge. They want, quote, to exact revenge and heap insults on all whose equals they are not. The will to equality is their virtue, so Zarathustra sees through it to what it really is, saying, quote, the tyrant's madness of impotence cries thus out of you for equality. Your secret tyrant's cravings mask themselves in your words of virtue. So the tarantulas make war on all that is high, rare, strange, and different. Quote, they were formerly the best world slanderers and burners of heretics. They are levelers who drag the high down to their level. The tarantulas are the opponents of all possible aristoi, egalitarian deniers who reject human difference. Zarathustra's justice recognizes inequality and allows human beings to be and become what they are. Quote, "Thus justice speaks to me. Humans are not equal," declares Zarathustra, and they shouldn't become so either. The tarantulas build what he calls their lie-hole lairs on the ruins of ancient greatness, and they try to disguise their revenge as a teaching on life and virtue. So what sort of political or social order characterizes the rule of the tarantulas? In Zarathustra's speech on the new idol, he tells us it is the state. This speech is crucial for grasping Nietzsche's political teaching. He's critiquing the Hegelian and post-Hegelian conception of the state. Zarathustra begins his speech by drawing a distinction between peoples and herds on the one hand and states on the other. Where Zarathustra and his brothers live, there are states. Rather than being a people or a herd, Zarathustra says the state is, quote, "the death of all peoples and the coldest of all cold monsters." It lies in claiming that it is the people. Peoples are the works of creators, i.e. legislators, philosophic or otherwise, who establish ways of life and tables of value. Founders, says Zarathustra, serve life and create peoples by placing, quote, "a faith and a love over them." The state does neither of these things. Rather, it is characterized by, quote, "the will to death," and it, quote, "beckons the preachers of death." Peoples have their own tongues of good and evil because they are characterized by different tables of value, while the state, quote, "lies in all the tongues of good and evil, presenting itself as universal." Zarathustra recognizes the danger the state poses to the natural aristoi. Quote, "Even to you, you great souls, it whispers its dark lies. It detects the rich hearts who gladly squander themselves. It also detects you, you vanquishers of the old god. You grew weary in battle, and now your weariness still serves the new idol. It wants to gather heroes and honorable men around itself, this new idol. Gladly it suns itself in the sunshine of your good consciences, the cold monster. Finally, Zarathustra says, it wants to give you everything if you worship it. The state seduces the virtue of the best. It tempts the noble such that it can become the object of all their ambitions. But in pursuing greatness in the state, the aristoi will only find mediocrity and dissatisfaction. The organs of government are rarely populated with the noble and virtuous. These honorable men and would-be heroes, having been seduced to place all their ambitions in the state, are transformed into what Zarathustra calls swift monkeys, clamoring over one another for power. This is an agonistic competition, surely, but it is an agonism in service of the state's ends, not the high or the noble. And as Zarathustra notes, what they really do is drag each other down into the mud. Interestingly, Nietzsche's concern for the power of the state to seduce the best among humanity is shared by Thomas Jefferson. In a letter to David Rittenhouse, Jefferson writes that there is an order of geniuses above the obligations of politics and government, and therefore exempted from it. Nobody can conceive that nature ever intended to throw away a Newton upon the occupations of a crown. Cooperating with nature in her ordinary economy, we should dispose of and employ the geniuses of men according to their several orders and degrees. Are those powers, then, which being intended for the erudition of the world, like air and light, the world's common property, to be taken from their proper pursuit to do the commonplace drudgery of governing a single state, a work which may be executed by men of an ordinary stature, such as are always and everywhere to be found? The universal and homogeneous state is the lie-hole lair of the tarantula. The tarantulas themselves are incompatible with justice as letting things be what they are because they intend a universal leveling. Zarathustra's convalescence is the point at which he enters a truly aristocratic and superior consciousness by overcoming his pity. He has overcome his abysmal thought and become just in that he can let things be what they are. The high can be the high, and the low can be the low. Rather than being a hard-hearted thing, his overcoming of pity is the most gentle and tolerant. It will not place excessive moral demands on the low, who as such could not meet these demands. It will allow them to be what they are, as well as allowing the high to be what they are. There is no chopping of tall stalks in Zarathustra's envisioned aristocracy. What does this mean politically? Ultimately, Nietzsche's solution to the problem of nihilism, of which the Tarantulas are a manifestation, lies in an understanding of three specific elements of his thought: how he conceives of the philosopher as a type and philosophy as an activity, what he means by values, and lastly, the intention behind the teaching of the eternal recurrence. Nietzsche writes, "Genuine philosophers are commanders and legislators. They say, 'Thus it shall be.' They determine the whither and for what of man, and in so doing have at their disposal the preliminary labor of all philosophical laborers, all who have overcome the past. With a creative hand, they reach for the future. All that is and has been becomes a means for them, an instrument, a hammer. Their knowing is creating, their creating is a legislation, their will to truth is will to power." So to say the philosopher is a commander and legislator is simply put to say that for Nietzsche, the philosopher is the one who creates values and establishes horizons. As an example, one can consider Aristotle. Aristotle's determination of being stands, even today, at the beginning of the sciences. And even today, the science that thinks it has transcended Aristotle is still ultimately grounded in and responsive to his categories and arguments. As Heidegger notes, the essential definition of truth since Plato and Aristotle dominates not only the whole of Western thought, but the history of Western man in general, down to his everyday doings and ordinary opinions and representations. His point is that over 2 millennia later, our encounter with the world is still mediated through terms derived from Plato and Aristotle. The Nietzschean philosopher gives order to the chaotic flux of the world and arbitrates what is possible, not merely in terms of morality and politics, but even in terms of the sciences. As commander and legislator, he establishes a way of life and a world. The cosmos, in reality, he writes, is for all eternity chaos, not in the sense of a lack of necessity, but of a lack of order, organization, form, beauty, wisdom, and whatever else our aesthetic anthropomorphisms are called. The philosopher as commander and legislator is the source of order, beauty, and these other aesthetic anthropomorphisms that make life livable and meaningful for the many. For Nietzsche, the fundamental danger faced by humanity is that the spirit of revenge, embodied by the Tarantulas, has come to dominate the world. The Christian Platonic transvaluation of values, while nevertheless deepening the spirit, established the conditions under which the Tarantula's own values could come to rule. His solution is yet another transvaluation of values, to be accomplished via the means of the eternal recurrence. A common misreading of Nietzsche is that the transvaluation of values is what allows us to affirm the eternal recurrence, but this is precisely backwards. The eternal recurrence is meant to function in the same manner as religion, according to Part 3 of Beyond Good and Evil functions. It is a doctrine meant to transform and beautify the human being, and as such, it is a means of what Nietzsche calls disciplining and breeding. In other words, the eternal recurrence is meant to be the content of a new philosophical legislation, and the transvaluation of values is the consequence. The eternal recurrence entails as a moral condition the affirmation of the different types, high and low, past and present and future. This project of breeding is not itself teleological except insofar as a purpose is imposed by the philosopher. It is akin to Darwinian evolution in the sense that this project of breeding and cultivation is grounded in adaptation, or what Nietzsche sometimes refers to as the plastic power. It is distinct from Darwinian evolution in that the adaptive power will be adapting itself to external conditions, including epistemological or hermeneutic conditions established by the philosopher. Philosophic legislators will not shape the individual directly, but will instead shape the conditions to which the adaptive or plastic power responds. Practically speaking, the philosopher rules via the enaction of new categories of being, and values emerge adaptively in response to these categories. This is ultimately a poetic procedure. On this account, philosophy bottoms out in poetry insofar as it is a creative act imposing a meaning and order onto chaos. The world as it is in itself is a chaos, inhospitable to humanity, while the world of any concern to us is a product of the philosophical will to power manifested in a poetic and creative act, telling human beings what they must be, and what the world is. Yet this philosophic legislator does not act alone, and in a sense has auxiliaries or adjutants. They are something like what Philip Rieff calls the officer class, or perhaps better, they are scientists of philosophy, such as Hegel, Kant, and others, who repress and reformulate the positing of values by the true philosophers. Nietzsche himself speaks of, quote, those who want to ascertain a complex fact of evaluations, in distinction to those who are, quote, legislators of such evaluations. These latter are, quote, commanders. They say, thus it shall be, and in doing so give to humanity a goal and an understanding of the world. Philosophers are, quote, those who make the most extreme efforts to test how far man could elevate himself. The true philosopher, says Nietzsche, is, quote, a Caesar-like man who cultivates and breeds the brutal man of culture, while this other sort is a tool, a piece of slave, although without a doubt the most sublime type of slave, but nothing in himself. Those of us in academia are the second type, to be sure. Political rule is neither necessary nor desirable for Nietzsche's higher types, as the rest of the speech on the New Idyll emphasizes. Nietzsche aims at the preservation of the conditions for aristocracy and even at the establishment of an aristocratic rule, but such an aristocracy need not be a literal aristocracy. The rule of the philosophers is a much subtler rule, and those ruled may be slaves of the philosopher, but not in any crude sense. One of the most insightful writers on Nietzsche sums it up well. The late Lawrence Lampert writes, quote, it belongs to our species to live enslaved, to truths or opinions that define the horizon within which life is experienced. Such slavery, he says, is natural and insurmountable. Nietzsche is an aristocrat in that he advocates the rule of those superior in terms of wisdom and virtue, i.e. the philosophers. But such a rule need not necessarily require traditional aristocratic social forms. Such rule establishes the horizons in which human beings live, and if Nietzsche's own project of philosophic legislation is successful, the new horizon he aims at will allow all beings, the high and the low, to be what they are, including the aristoi. That's it.